to cover what you can do to assess, prepare, and prevent shoulder injuries. A few years ago, I came across a study that changed the way I see CrossFit. It did mention quite a lot of shoulder injuries, but it did mention specifically that it was the way that CrossFit is put together minus a massive lack of shoulder stability and mobility emphasis that was causing this combination. Loads of people mention that CrossFit is inherently dangerous and that's why they don't do it, but that's not really what the research shows. So a few years ago, I came across a study that did in fact say, yes, indeed, there are a lot of shoulder injuries in CrossFit compared to, say, other ways of getting fit. So for example, like going to the gym, but it doesn't necessarily mean that CrossFit itself is the reason. Basically, CrossFit is not the cause of all of this. It is what's going on behind the scenes, or what's rather not going on behind the scenes to prepare you for CrossFit. So say, for example, you are simply new to movement and you are not necessarily that into mobility training and you're not checking your shoulder mobility and stability before you're going into these movements, and then you're doing a huge volume of them progressively. This combination is what causes the issue. The key insight is that the movements that cause the issues are overdone. So there's a huge amount of pushing, a lot of overhead movements, and a lot of movements that require you to have perfect shoulder mobility. So for example, snatches, where you require a huge amount of internal rotation, an amount of shoulder extension. Even this will be affected in bench press or push-up. So if you're doing a huge amount of these movements over and over again, but your shoulder range of motion isn't there, both in terms of range and stability, and if this hasn't been checked, then this is obviously going to be an issue. So unfortunately, traditional CrossFit programming can set you up for failure if you're not looking into these things beforehand. The first thing is the high rep ranges, things like thrusters, handstand push-ups, overhead press work. The second thing is multiple sessions per week, which are very push heavy for your shoulders. The third thing is minimal emphasis on shoulder mobility and stability. And the fourth is a limited focus on joint function in general or individual analysis. So quite a few CrossFit coaches and CrossFit box owners have taken our CPT mobility certification simply for the fact that they can then do the joint assessments with everybody and then be able to prevent future injuries simply by screening them properly ahead of time. Now, this does take a lot of time. We're doing the whole body joint assessment. So every single joint is tested in terms of range, but then it's also tested in terms of functional movement screens. So I can't go through all of that in this video, but I can make you aware that at the very least, you should be checking your shoulder internal rotation, your shoulder external rotation, shoulder flexion, and shoulder extension, because these end up having a huge carryover effect into if you can even do the most common CrossFit movements. As well, you should be looking at your scapular function. An easy test would be to simply look at your scapular cars, and also to check your spinal mobility, specifically focusing on your cervical and thoracic spine, because that is also going to be very, very needed in your overhead squats. So there is a solution. CrossFit is not just bad for you. There is so many things you can do to make it work for you. The first thing is getting a joint assessment, or at least trying to do the minimal tests that I just mentioned before. The second thing would be adjusting your programming. So for example, if you have several consecutive days of overhead work, that should have a rest day for your shoulders between. You should be trying to balance your push movements with your pull movements. And the third one is a little bit difficult because essentially it's just scaling back to the capacity of your shoulders rather than pushing in every single session. So this might mean that for a year or two, you are just working on your mobility, stability, and strength capacity, and then later going into pushing yourself in workout. In the beginning, say you are brand new to it, it's really not a great idea to be pushing yourself when you don't have the range, you don't have the stability, and you don't even have the strength base yet. Simply thinking of how your connective tissue works, your tendons, they do not have much blood supply. So trying to push that in ranges they don't have is a recipe for disaster. The third point is quite simple, and it's just shoulder preparation work. So you could be doing your shoulder mobility and stability between sessions, and you can also be preparing your shoulders for what's to come in the session as well. So not just a quick warm up with bands or a PVC pipe, actually spending a decent amount of time to prep the tissues and the surrounding muscles that are responsible for that joint function. So for example, if you are going to be doing any snatch work or overhead work, you're going to need your shoulder rotation and your shoulder flexion working in a good capacity. So there's several exercises you could do. To begin with, you want to be starting with isometrics and eccentrics, not going into just reps, because then you're just going into that end range for just a moment rather than spending a decent amount of time building up stability and strength. So shoulder external rotation isometrics are a good place to start. You can also do shoulder flexion flexion isometrics and do slow, controlled, and eventually weighted controlled articular rotations. As your warm-up, that should come first. So you start with your slow, controlled articular rotations. Then you move on to your isometrics in ranges that you need to build more stability and end range in. Then you can think about doing your normal warm-ups as you would in your workouts. So things like PVC pipes or disconnects and lighter loaded press work. So the moral of the story is CrossFit is not bad. The movements in CrossFit are not bad. It's just the dosage and the speed in which people are getting started with them without necessarily testing their shoulder range of motion and whether the capacity is there to be doing those movements. So if you're not sure where to start, you can comment test below and we'll send you a link on what we do in terms of joint assessments online, or you can see if there's a mobility certified coach near you to do them with you, or if you're a coach, you can learn on our certification how to do the joint assessments.